Paragraph 100. Mr. Combs' facial expression shifted as he stepped towards Ms. Richard, raised his arm, and swung his fist toward her face. Believing that Mr. Combs was going to hit her, Miss Richard braced for the impact. Before Mr. Combs could strike her, Mr. Combs's bodyguard grabbed her, escorted her out of the studio, and forced her into the Bad Boy Records Bentley that was parked outside. Miss Harper ran after Miss Richard, and Mr. Combs' bodyguard closed and locked the Bentley's doors with both women inside. Inside the vehicle, Ms. Richard realized there were no interior door handles and that they were locked inside with no way to escape. Miss Richard's belongings were in the studio, but she was able to call her father from Miss Harper's cell phone. Miss Richard relayed to her father what had happened and that she needed help and feared that she would go missing. Moments later, Mr. Combs's bodyguard removed only Miss Harper from the Bentley, leaving Miss Richard locked in the car alone for over 2 hours. Paragraph 102. Miss Richard screamed as loudly as she could, but no one responded. It was late evening in the winter time, the windows were heavily tinted, and the interior of the car was dark except for faint interior lights. Miss Richard's belongings and winter coat were in the studio, while the ignition was off and there was no heat. With Mr. Combs' prior threats and violence running through her mind, Miss Richard felt sheer panic, terror, and feelings of claustrophobia at being locked in a small, dark, enclosed space with no way to communicate or call for help. She began to feel cold and feared for her life, not knowing when or if she would be released. Miss Richard's father drove to New York from Baltimore and arrived at the studio approximately 2 hours later. Only after her father arrived and demanded to see her did Mr. Pierre order Mr. Combs' bodyguard to release Miss Richard from the vehicle. Mr. Pierre ushered Miss Richard's father between several rooms at SIR Studios, where he waited for approximately 2 hours before being able to confront Mr. Combs. Once Miss Richard's father expressed that he intended to contact police, Mr. Combs warned him to think about your family and think about your daughter's career. Her father appeared visibly frightened by Mr. Combs's threats and actions, which in turn made Miss Richard feel terrified for herself and her family's safety. This is deeply disturbing, and yet, heartbreakingly, it's almost what we've come to expect. Don Richard, a former member of Danity Kane, has just filed a new lawsuit against Sean Diddy Combs. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. Another lawsuit? Sadly, it's like the shockwaves have dulled, and instead of outrage, we've become numb. Like, oh, another one. Not surprised. But let me tell you, the details in this lawsuit, they'll stop you in your tracks. It's the sheer graphic nature of what's described that forces you to pause and really take it all in. Let's dive into what Dawn Richards says she endured. First off, Dawn alleges that Diddy trapped her in a car. This wasn't just an uncomfortable moment. It was pure intimidation. Imagine being confined in that small locked space, unable to escape as someone with immense power and influence imposes his will on you. Dawn says he made unwanted, inappropriate advances, and there she was, powerless, vulnerable, no way out. Can you picture that fear? Being trapped, knowing you have no control? It's the kind of moment that stays with you, that haunts you. And then there's the dressing room incident. Dawn claims Diddy barged in without warning, crossing every boundary in the most invasive way possible. On numerous occasions between approximately 2009 and 2011, under the guise of preparing for performances, Mr. Combs would intrude into Miss Richards' changing room at Daddy's house unannounced while Miss Richard was undressed. 87. Even though a female stylist was present and assisting Miss Richard with her wardrobe, Mr. Combs would grope Miss Richards' body, including her bare buttocks and her chest area near her breasts. With no legitimate purpose, and without Miss Richards' consent, Mr. Combs caressed her buttocks to show the stylist where he wanted her high-waisted panties positioned, and attempted to touch her breasts, claiming to show the stylist where he wanted her bra straps to go. 88. When Mr. Combs would enter the changing room, Miss Richard would cover her chest with her hands to prevent Mr. Combs from seeing or touching her breasts. When Mr. Combs would touch her body, Miss Richard would attempt to swat his hands away and state, "Don't touch me." 89. Mr. Combs frequently smacked Miss Richards' bare buttocks and often commented on her body, noting that although she was too skinny, she had an ass. Ignoring her visible and communicated discomfort, Mr. Combs persisted and continued to intrude when Miss Richard was in the dressing room, continued to touch her buttocks and breast area under the guise of showing the stylist what to do, and continued to smack her buttocks without her consent. 91. In or around October 2010, Diddy, Dirty Money performed in Glasgow, Scotland, where Mr. Combs engaged in overt sexual advances towards Miss Richard. On numerous occasions, when Miss Richard exited the dressing room fully styled, Mr. Combs looked at her approvingly and smacked her buttocks while making comments such as, "You're looking good. Okay, Dawn, okay. And I see what that is," in a flirtatious tone. Each time, Ms. Richard moved away and asked him not to touch her, but Mr. Combs disregarded her protests. 92. On their last night in Glasgow, Ms. Richard witnessed Mr. Combs and several other males banging Mr. Combs's female assistant at the hotel pool. Ms. Richard immediately left and went to her hotel room. It's 93. On their flight back to the United States the next day, Ms. Richard asked Mr. Combs where his assistant was. Mr. Combs replied, "I don't give a fuck where that bitch is." Ms. Richard later learned that Mr. Combs had taken his assistant's passport with him to the United States, leaving the assistant stranded in the United Kingdom. Think about that. A space meant to be private, suddenly violated, and you can't just walk away because he's the boss. The power dynamic is suffocating. You endure, you swallow the fear, because speaking up could mean losing everything you've worked for. But it wasn't just her. 44, Miss Richard was present when Mr. Combs was introduced to Cassandra, Cassie Ventura, for the first time in or around 2006. The moment Mr. Combs first saw Ms. Ventura, his demeanor noticeably shifted. Mr. Combs positioned himself directly in front of Ms. Ventura's seat, invading her personal space, and fixated on her with an intense, unyielding stare, isolating her from the other people in the room, including Ms. Ventura's then-boyfriend, music producer Ryan Leslie. 45. Coincidentally, this first meeting between Mr. Combs and Ms. Ventura was the first time that Ms. Richard was in Mr. Combs's presence without a camera crew filming. Observing Mr. Combs behave in such an intimidating, predatory manner the first time that they were off camera made Ms. Richard feel deeply apprehensive and afraid of him. Dawn says she saw Diddy physically attack Cassie Ventura, choking her, pulling her, dragging her up the stairs. These aren't just words, they're violent, horrifying images that linger. And the scalding hot pan of eggs? Yes, she claims he threw it at Cassie, without a shred of regard for her safety. 56. Initial recording for Diddy. Dirty Money's album Last Train to Paris took place in Mr. Combs' home on Doheny Drive in Los Angeles, California. On the first day of recording, Miss Richard and Miss Harper arrived at Mr. Combs' home and waited in the kitchen, where Mr. Combs' girlfriend, Miss Ventura, was frying eggs for him. Miss Richard observed Mr. Combs come down the stairs looking high on drugs, enter the kitchen, approach Miss Ventura, and scream, "I've been asking you for my shit. I can't stand you, bitch. You never do it right." Mr. Combs pushed Miss Ventura against the wall and choked her, then picked up the scalding hot pan of eggs and threw it at her, causing her to fall to the ground in a fetal position. Cursing and screaming, Mr. Combs dragged Miss Ventura up the stairs. 58. Frozen in shock and terror, Miss Richard heard glass shattering, crashing, and banging noises as Mr. Combs dragged Miss Ventura up the stairs. Miss Richard wanted to intervene and help Miss Ventura, but Harper adamantly refused to interfere in Mr. Combs' relationship and physically led Miss Richard out of the residence. Terrified and shaken, Miss Richard returned to her hotel where she was unable to sleep due to worrying about Miss Ventura and her own safety. 59. The following day, then Miss Richard received a call demanding that she return to Mr. Combs' residence to continue recording. Mr. Combs brought Miss Richard and Miss Harper into the recording room at his studio, locked the door, dimmed the lights, and gave each of them flowers. Mr. Combs went on at length, stating, This is normal. This was just a lover's argument where no one was hurt. This is what love is. I'm giving you an opportunity. If you want to make it, you'll shut your mouth. If you say anything, there will be consequences." Mr. Combs further warned that people end up missing, being threatened while locked for over 20 minutes in a small enclosed space with Mr. Combs. After observing Mr. Combs violently assault Ms. Ventura the day before, Miss Richard was terrified and genuinely believed that Mr. Combs would follow through on his threats. The thought of it, the pain, the terror, is hard to even imagine. Dawn paints a chilling picture of the world Diddy created, a world built on fear, manipulation, and control. She describes threats, verbal attacks, and emotional abuse that kept everyone on edge. Diddy allegedly threatened her life with statements like, "I make people disappear." That's not just intimidation. It's terror. Imagine living in that kind of constant fear, knowing that at any moment the person who holds all the power could turn on you. And then there's what Dawn witnessed happening to other women. She talks about parties where young women were clearly not in control of their own bodies, passed out or barely conscious, while Diddy and his associates allegedly took advantage. This wasn't just partying. It was predatory, sinister, a far cry from the glitz and glam the public sees. 60. In or around November 2009, after the Soul Train Awards in Atlanta, Georgia, Mr. Combs flew Miss Richard and Miss Harper to his house in New York on his private jet for an after-party. There were many well-known celebrities at the after-party, and copious amounts of illegal drugs were being openly consumed. Upon information and belief, Mr. Combs had arranged for dozens of young women and girls, some of whom appeared to be underage, to be transported to the party. The women arrived wearing little to no clothing and were given drugs and alcohol. Many of them appeared lethargic or passed out, while Mr. Combs and his guests performed sexual acts on them. Miss Richard believed that her presence at the party was a test to see whether Mr. Combs could trust her. Mr. Combs repeatedly said things like, "This is a buffet. Enjoy yourselves. This is what we do. This is how we party." Ms. Richard felt shocked and horrified at the sight of Mr. Combs and his guests violating incapacitated young women, and implored Mr. Combs' personal assistant, Capricorn Clark, to allow her to leave. Ms. Clark insisted that Miss Richard wait 15 minutes for Ms. Clark to make it make sense. That is, to make Miss Richard's exit less conspicuous so that Mr. Combs would not notice that she had left. Knowing that she was not free to leave and had to wait for Miss Clark to help her orchestrate her departure, Miss Richard experienced feelings of panic and being trapped against her will. 62. Mr. Combs regularly placed Miss Richard in similar situations with no means to escape. At Mr. Combs' drug-fueled parties, his guests, including Miss Richard, were required to surrender their phones upon entry. Mr. Combs kept the doors locked and guarded by security personnel, making it impossible for Miss Richard to leave without alerting Mr. Combs that she had done so. Mr. Combs hired police officers to attend his parties, sending a clear message to guests that his influence extended to law enforcement officers, and creating a climate of fear and a tacit warning that reporting him to authorities would be both unacceptable and futile. 63. On many occasions, Mr. Combs had parties at his Miami, Florida residence that lasted for several days. At one of the parties, Ms. Richard witnessed Mr. Combs openly stating that he had arranged for busloads of young exotic girls, such as mixed black and Asian, Indonesian, and albino. Once again, Miss Richard observed inebriated young girls being sexually violated by Mr. Combs and his guests. In a state of panic and terror, Miss Richard fled to the bedroom Mr. Combs had insisted she stay in and barricaded the door shut with furniture. 64. Mr. Combs openly assaulted Ms. Ventura in front of Miss Richard and other witnesses on multiple occasions. On one occasion, in or around the fall of 2009, Diddy, Dirty Money was in New York preparing to perform at a festival. Inside their vehicle, Mr. Combs grabbed Ms. Ventura's neck, pulled her out of the van onto the grass, and pinned her head down, choking her while yelling, "You gonna get fucked up today." This incident took place in the backstage area just outside the festival and was entirely visible to passersby. 65. In another instance, in or around early 2010, Mr. Combs punched Miss Ventura in the face in the bathroom of a party in Los Angeles. Frequently, when Ms. Ventura attempted to voice an opinion or stand up to Mr. Combs, he would strike her or wrap his hands around her throat and choke her. 66. On the first several occasions that they observed Mr. Combs assault Miss Ventura, Miss Richard and Miss Harper spoke with Ms. Ventura to support and encourage Ms. Ventura in escaping her abusive relationship with Mr. Combs. Every time that Miss Richard and Miss Harper tried to intervene, Mr. Combs learned of the conversation and became irate. Mr. Combs screamed at the women, "Y'all bitches don't get in my relationship. Don't tell my bitch, Ms. Ventura, what she need to be doing. Just make money and shut the fuck up. I end artists. I shelve careers. You could be missing, and you bitches want to die today," among other threats. One of the most heartbreaking moments she shares is seeing Kim Porter, the mother of Diddy's children, with visible injuries on her face. Dawn says it wasn't unusual for Kim to show signs of physical violence, yet no one intervened. It was as if the fear and silence around Diddy's actions paralyzed everyone. Miss Richard observed Mr. Combs's ex-partner and the mother of 3 of his children, Kim Porter, leaving Mr. Combs's recording studio in tears with visible facial injuries, including a lacerated lip. Realizing that Mr. Combs was capable of committing acts of violence against women caused Miss Richard to feel deep apprehension and fear that Mr. Combs could one day physically harm her. Dawn also claims Diddy was sexually exploitative toward female artists, coercing them into compromising positions as if it was a twisted price to pay for their careers. It's a sickening cycle of control, exploitation, and fear that Dawn says she saw firsthand. So, why does this lawsuit stand out? It's not just another case, it's a deeply personal account of relentless suffering and trauma. Dawn wasn't just on the sidelines, she was caught in this toxic vortex, witnessing the worst of Diddy, carrying those memories like scars. 47, for the majority of Ms. Richards' tenure as a member of Danity Kane and Diddy Dirty Money, Mr. Combs required her to remain at his various residences and studios in New York, Los Angeles, Florida, and New Jersey for activities such as recording, rehearsing, dressing, preparing costumes, and exercising. Throughout the productions of Making the Band 3 and 4, Mr. Combs deprived Miss Richard and her Danity Kane bandmates of basic needs such as adequate food and sleep. When Miss Richard or her Danity Kane bandmates requested meals or rest, Mr. Combs refused and chastised them with derogatory comments like, "You don't want this," or "Y'all are not hungry enough," and "I'm paying you to work." This demeaning behavior gradually undermined Miss Richards' confidence and contributed significantly to her growing feelings of insecurity and fear of reprisal from Mr. Combs. 49. Upon information and belief, Mr. Combs would regularly be awake for prolonged periods of time because he was high on drugs. During these periods, Mr. Combs demanded continuous access to Ms. Richard and her Danity Kane bandmates, often forcing them to record and rehearse for stretches of 36 to 48 hours without breaks. Forced to choose between eating and sleeping, Ms. Richard lost a significant amount of weight, weighing approximately 100 pounds at a height of 5'4". Ms. Richard began to normalize these extreme conditions and perceive them as standard requirements of her participation in Danity Kane. Mr. Combs regularly sent his associates to wake Miss Richard and her Danity Kane bandmates in the overnight hours so he could watch them rehearse. The regularity of these disturbances led Miss Richard to adapt by sleeping in a sitting position, fully dressed and with makeup on, heightening her anxiety. Over time, this abnormal sleeping arrangement came to feel routine, further normalizing Mr. Combs' invasive demands. 51. In addition to exhausting rehearsals, Mr. Combs, Miss Richard, and her bandmates to participate in intense workouts with a personal trainer. On one occasion, while running on the beach, Miss Richard became so dehydrated that she vomited. Instead of offering medical assistance, MTV Network's camera crew filmed the incident, contributing to her acceptance of such treatment as part of her professional life. 52. The unrelenting and rigorous schedule of rehearsals, performance, and near-constant filming that Mr. Combs imposed caused Ms. Richard to experience extreme weight loss, dehydration, fatigue, and painful rashes from the microphone pack she was required to wear on her back. These conditions intensified Ms. Richards' feelings of powerlessness as she increasingly viewed them as part of her professional reality and feared the consequences of any resistance. 53. In a further assertion of power and dominance, Mr. Combs insisted on holding meetings while dressed only in his underwear. On one occasion in 2008 at his Miami residence, Mr. Combs emailed Miss Richard directing her to meet him in the living room. When she arrived, he was wearing only his underwear. Miss Richard asked Mr. Combs to put clothes on, but he refused, stating, "This is my fucking house." Mr. Combs then conducted a meeting lasting approximately an hour while dressed in his underwear, causing Miss Richard to feel violated and embarrassed, and amplifying her feelings of powerlessness. 54. Following the official Danity Kane breakup in early 2009, effectuated by Mr. Combs, Miss Richard experienced significant financial hardship. With no prospective opportunities for employment within the entertainment field, Ms. Richards spent several months traveling from Baltimore to Daddy's house recording studio in New York without pay or allocated budget. Mr. Combs promised that Miss Richards' compositions would result in payment of license fees and royalties pursuant to her contract with Bad Boy Records. However, no such compensation was ever reported or paid to Ms. Richard. Damages relative to these continuing copyright infringements will be proved at trial. Despite everything, Dawn Richard is still standing, still fighting. She's been putting out new music consistently almost every month, and let me tell you, she looks incredible doing it. Her talent, her resilience, it's all right there in her videos, which you can find on YouTube. Dawn isn't just surviving, she's thriving. She refuses to let this lawsuit define her, and that's the kind of strength that deserves our respect. But we can't lose sight of what she's fighting for. This isn't just about holding Diddy accountable for what allegedly happened to her. It's about exposing a culture of abuse that's been allowed to flourish in the industry. Dawn didn't just see Cassie and Kim Porter suffer. She saw countless other women trapped in this web of power and fear. She saw things most of us could never imagine, things that left her haunted, yet determined to speak out. And now she's bravely putting it all out there, despite the public's desensitization to these stories. This isn't just another lawsuit. Yes, Diddy has faced many accusations. Honestly, we've lost count. But each case carries its own weight of pain, its own deeply disturbing details. Dawn's lawsuit is no different in that it speaks to a pattern, but what sets it apart is the sheer personal suffering she describes. It's not just about money, fame, or even revenge. It's about confronting power, control, and the fear that has kept so many silent for so long. So, as more details emerge, we have to ask ourselves, will this finally be the case that brings about real consequences? Or will it, like so many others, fade into the background, forgotten until the next headline grabs our attention? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you haven't already, check out Dawn's latest music videos on YouTube. Despite everything she's been through, her talent shines brighter than ever. Dawn Richard isn't just a victim. She's a fighter, an artist, and someone who refuses to let her past dictate her future. But again, let's not lose sight of the bigger picture. Dawn isn't just fighting for herself. She's fighting for all the women who suffered in silence. This lawsuit isn't just about Diddy. It's about an industry that has long ignored or dismissed the voices of women, especially when those voices speak out against powerful men. Dawn's lawsuit adds another layer to the troubling narrative of what life was like behind closed doors, locked in cars, violated in private spaces, and witnessing unspeakable violence. It paints a portrait of a pattern of abuse that affected not just one or two women, but countless others who were pulled into Diddy's orbit of power and control. These aren't just salacious headlines. They're stories of real trauma, lived by real people. Dawn's courage to step forward and share her truth is a significant, powerful act of defiance against a system that has allowed these abuses to go unchecked. She's exposing a reality that many in the industry would rather keep hidden, a reality that goes far beyond the glitz and glamour of the music world and into a much darker, more dangerous place. As this case unfolds, one thing is clear. This isn't something we should ignore. It's not just about holding one man accountable. It's about demanding change in an industry that has too often turned a blind eye to violence and exploitation. And it's on us to listen, to believe, and to push for the justice that so many deserve. So, what do you think? Could this lawsuit finally be the turning point for Diddy? Or will it end up like so many others, slowly fading into the background while the cycle continues? Let's talk about it in the comments below. Your voices matter in this conversation. And if you haven't already, make sure to like, subscribe, and share this video. This isn't just entertainment gossip. These are accounts of real suffering, pain, and survival, and they deserve our attention. Dawn's bravery in coming forward is a powerful reminder that silence can be just as damaging as the abuse itself. So let's not brush this off as just another lawsuit. Let's keep the conversation going, keep asking the hard questions, and keep the pressure on for accountability. Behind every accusation is a person who has lived through pain, fear, and trauma. Thanks again for tuning in. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share if you found this discussion important. And most of all, keep the conversation going, because change starts when we refuse to look the other way. Until the next story, take care of yourselves and each other. Thanks for watching, friends.